get started here. While you're working on that, Dr. Henry, let me pray for a moment and ask the Lord to watch over our time together and our technology. And oh, Father, we do depend on you totally for all things. You know this technology, Lord, so we just do ask you to let everything work well for us so that we can share, talk. Please help Arissa get his system working, and please just help us to have all the technology working well. Please, Lord, continue to give each one of us wisdom for the projects that you're inspiring for each to be doing, and just pray that we can do all things with excellence, even as you command us to do through your word. And I pray that you will give us clear thinking, critical thinking, the ability to put our ideas forth in a way that are accurate and convincing. And Lord, we just really need you to help us do these things. It's nothing we can do on our own. We have learning and skills that we can pass on, but Lord, it's ultimately you who gives the ability to do anything in this lifetime. So we just pray that you'll work with each one now, Father, and give each one what is needed to accomplish your work. It's in your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, we're continuing to work our way through the literature review. Okay, looks like Arissa, looks like you're back in. Good.
Yes, I am. Thanks.
All right. Let's just have a little bit of an open time of discussion. We had started to talk through one issue with Arissa before his computer issues jumped in, and I think we were talking about, focusing a problem. I think we've been talking about that in one of the discussions. That was one of the assignments was to keep working on focusing, and that doesn't usually happen just in one discussion room. We understand that it's something as you continue to read, gather information about your topic. Often it starts to become a little more clear in your mind in terms of possibly what, a way to even narrow the focus that would be workable within a dissertation time period. Since we were starting there with you, Arissa, maybe we'll just jump in with you a second and if you can still hear us, and we can hear you. Arissa is working on the whole idea of, aid-based help compared to asset-based help. And I know that, at least that was the topic that you had started on. I know you've been working on things called savings communities that are being formed through the Hope International group. And I know you kind of had a little phrase that you had gleaned from scriptures in terms of what's in your hand, which is basically an asset-based question, really. When it's the idea of, what do you already have that can be put to work in new ways, possibly, to meet needs. At least that's the way I'm thinking of your topic right now. I mean, I know you were talking about, some of the models, concepts, theoretical parts of a theoretical framework. One was, ABCD, asset-based community development. That was one of the models that you were going to work with. The whole issue of you were talking about maybe some biblical principles. I know that's where we're working this week. I think at one time you were talking about the widow and her faith, and being able to use what she had. Collaboration in the Bible, God's provision. Maybe just talk through a little more, Arissa, in terms of you think about your topic. I know sometimes it's hard to get your hands around the whole topic, but at this point in time, try to just summarize what it is you want to do, and then maybe some of us can jump in to help maybe even narrow that topic a little bit.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Payne. So you said it because I am looking at the aid-based approach to development as a predominant approach in Africa. So that is kind of one of the components. I like to explore that, its challenges and how it has fared, the last 6 decades or so. Then I would like to talk about asset-based approach to development. And in the asset-based development, I would like to look at the biblical principles that kind of back up the asset-based in the context of savings and credit associations. I think in short, that's what I'm trying to look at. I'm trying to look at moving from aid-based to asset-based, but under asset-based, I'd like to look at the biblical principles in the context of savings and credit associations. So I guess what I'm struggling with is how do I formulate that into a focused problem and a focused topic and a focused study. But in general, that's what is, fighting in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Would you say the work that you're doing with Hope International right now, do you believe that the model that is currently in place is more of an aid-based as opposed to an asset-based? Do you believe that's really what the situation is right now? How would you describe the work, the model that is being implemented right now through your group?
Right, that is an asset base. It's an asset base.
Okay, so
it's being implemented in the context, in the environment of an aid-based kind of culture. Yeah.
Okay. So are you thinking the problem then is the environment in which you're working is comprised of people that have more of an aid-based mentality, that they need people to come and give them resources, things. That's what they've been brought up to think, and that's kind of the mindset that the majority of people are in. Would that be your assessment of your situation right now?
Correct, and that is the main challenge when we introduce the asset-based approach.
Okay.
That's the main challenge. The transition, the paradigm shift is the main challenge.
Right. Okay. And tell me again, what's the exact community in which you're doing a lot of your work?
Well, I am based in Rwanda, but Hope International promotes savings in several other African, Asia, and South America countries. We're in 17 countries where we implement, but mostly in Africa.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, what do we think? Let's just kind of maybe work on that as a group. Anybody can jump in. The problem, as I understand Arissa describing it, and say in an area of Rwanda, and he'll contextualize that into a specific area of Rwanda, but it's that people tend to have an aid-based mentality in terms of, as opposed to an asset-based mentality. And we know an asset-based mentality is trying to look at what we already have and being able to mobilize those resources, learning how to, cooperate with other people, each other in a situation in order to meet needs. Where an aid-based, and of course there's just a lot of, at least from my perspective, there's been a lot of thinking and research on the whole issue of the failures of just a solely aid-based model, where we just keep throwing money and resources at a situation, but we've not really helped people learn how to use resources wisely. I'm just kind of brainstorming right now. So we're trying, Arissa is in a situation of trying to find ways to change people's perceptions from an aid-based mentality to an asset-based mentality. Now, does that seem to be a narrow enough focus? Is there anything that can be done to that? And it's always, of course, difficult. The most difficult thing is, trying to change the way people perceive things. When we talk about transformation, we know that's a slow process, and we've talked about that before. But what do you think about that, defining the problem in that way? Changing people's perception from an aid-based model to an asset-based model in a particular area of Rwanda.
I think it's a good point of view. It's also a good good way to start. Last year, I tried that in our community through ABCD project. I was taking the course, and in my perspective, it was very good. It was a good start, but I don't think at least in my case, I don't think they knew how to deal with that after discovering it. What do we do now? And what next? Should we get together? Should you do, So it was the beginning of something, in my perspective. It's very important. It's crucial. It's a new mentality, a new mindset, but they will expect more. What is the next step?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So for me,
sorry.
Go ahead, Dr. Henry.
Yes. I'm not going to share my screen, but I've pulled up, let me pull up my last comments to Erissa in terms of the focus. And I'm just pulling up that document again on my screen. Okay. And I think, but Arista knows this because I've sent it to him with the comments that I've made. I think part of the struggle that Arista is going through in terms of focus is that he wants to look at both aid-based development and asset-based development. And if that is what you would like to do, Arissa, as I said to you, then you probably want to do a comparative study, which would mean that you would examine organizations or look at an organization that is built on aid-based development, and then look at an organization that is based on asset-based development, and then compare their results. That would be a comparative study. And so far, from what you have submitted in the discussion section, that is not really what I see you wanting to do. I referenced you, I had you go back to your week 4 discussion and the questions, and it was clear from those questions that your focus would be on the asset-based development, and you would look at the work of the SCAs to illustrate that, and that focus was very clear. So I recommended to you that you keep that focus, but I'm still hearing you, and I understand that referencing the aid-based development. Now, the way in which you would bring that into your study is that you would reference that in terms of the context, that the context is one where the prevailing method is aid-based community development. And that we will understand, but at this point, I would not advise you to want to study the two at once. That would make for a large study, which is doable, but let's be practical. You want to finish this, and you want to finish it well. And that is why it's important that you focus. After you've done this study, you probably would want to do a comparative study on your own later, and that's fine. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Actually, what I'm hearing, and that's helpful, what I'm hearing is I will keep the aid-based discussion under the context and just, confine that to context. Because, I mean, in reality, it is the context, it is the environment, it is what people are used to. So I will confine that discussion under context, and then focus on aid-based, focus on asset-based, the biblical principles, and in the context of saving and credit associations.
Yeah, I was just going to add, as I thought about it, is that it sounds like you've already concluded that asset-based is the way you want to go. So back to Dr. Henry's point, I think it's best to just focus it on what are the strategies to move in that direction and make it very practical. And what are the whether it's through the church, the public sector, what are the different sectors you want to engage, because it becomes an educational piece as well, to move in that direction, and perhaps use appreciative inquiry in terms of ways to kind of move people's mindset, get them to dream about what it could be. But back to Dr. Henry's point, I think you've concluded that you want to move to asset-based, so just focus it there. You can put, as you said, the aid-based in the context.
Yeah, thank you. I guess the struggle that I was having is in the statement of the problem, but I have the clarity in terms of what I want to do. I want to do asset-based in the context of savings, but in phrasing the problem, I think that's where the aid-based kept on coming. So now I think I need to clarify my statement, so that it doesn't include aid-based. Aid-based should be in the context, and I think that will align with what I'm thinking in my mind.
Let me make one other statement. I'm thinking about a dissertation project that I've just completed working with a student. I was her supervisor for the last year, Tisha. She's working over in Jamaica. She's working with the Nazarene Compassionate Ministries, okay? The problem that she saw, that she was working with, was again a mindset among both Jamaican ministries that are trying to help people, provide resources, and a mindset of the people who are receiving resources, okay? She used the term, which comes from Robert Lupton, toxic charity, which that's one of our textbooks, not in this course, but we use it in other courses. That and there's another one by Fickett and Corbett, when helping hurts. And a lot of you are familiar with some of these textbooks, but those two books are representative of the issue of how we can give aid to people in one way that it actually doesn't empower them. It actually disempowers them and makes them become more of a dependent mindset. So what Tisha did, she felt, first of all, her assumption, and you got the assumption that the asset-based approach is the better approach that produces better results. Now, if you wanted to, like Dr. Henry said, you can compare a couple of organizations if you decided you want to actually prove that. Or you can just say, this is an assumption you're going into the project with. Your assumption is the asset-based model produces better results in the lives of people. You're not going to necessarily prove that through your dissertation. It's an assumption that you're using. What you're then doing is you may choose to look at a group of people to just confirm your suspicion that a common mindset among a particular community in Rwanda, let's just use that as a context, a common thinking is the best. If you ask a person, what do you think would help you in your situation best? And somebody says, well, I need somebody to give me more money. I need somebody to give me, okay, by that question, you are confirming the suspicion that people tend to think, if you'll just give me more, I'll be able to make it better in my life. You could survey some people and to confirm that thought in your mind. You could survey both people that are possibly receiving aid, and you could survey, you could interview leadership people who are in organizations that are giving aid to see what is a common mindset. Is it true that the aid-based mindset that's common? You could confirm that. Okay, what Tisha, my advisee, did, she did that. She interviewed a representative sample of people in a particular area of Jamaica to understand their mindset in terms of asset-based and aid-based. She used the term toxic charity. Okay, when she started working with leaders, she said, if I say the term toxic charity, what would that mean to you? Because most people had no idea what that meant, those who were in leadership. And she designed several questions to understand what is the mindset of people who are in current compassionate ministries, to understand what is their mindset. And she did that with people who are receiving aid. She did that with people who are in the process of giving aid. She also interviewed some just general community leaders and asked them questions that related to some of these same kinds of concepts. Based on the answers that she received, she then began to develop a multimedia campaign. And she's doing things through television, internet, in order to find ways to keep getting a message out to help change people's thinking about what kind of compassion really helps a situation. And so she began to devise, she actually put together, 2 courses that she then, taught that course to some people in compassionate ministries. So that was another part of her transformational leadership strategy. Okay, but she was, checking out the perception of people and the people receiving aid and the people giving aid to understand what is their mindset. And then she tried to understand what is some of the feelings of just general community leaders about what really would help people in situations. And then, based on what she did in terms of the research, she began to develop a course that she taught, and she began to develop some multimedia messages that she was able to get out into whatever the popular public service message, hers was television. Okay, she designed some messages for adults. She even designed some messages using cartoons for kids, so that they would start to get a message even early on that we really are responsible for what God has put in our hands. So she was kind of dealing with the same kind of the common issue you are. She was just doing that in the Jamaican context. You're doing it in the Rwanda context. I'll stop there and we can just have some more feedback on that issue.
Hello, Dr. B.
Hello, Tammy.
Yeah, I've been processing ERESA's project about access-based and aid-based. My thinking, is there no possibility of a meeting point, a convergence between the two, or a process of coming out with another theory of a mixed approach? Because bringing people out of aid aid-based mentality is not an easy one, especially in Africa.
Mhm.
So I don't know if there will be a middle point or a mixture of the two. What theory or what principle will that come up with? Maybe, I don't know why Ressa can research on something like that to come with, because so long as Jesus said, so long as you are in this world, we'll have the poor with us. I will keep helping people. People will keep depending on people. How can we strike a balance and come up with a more a concept that has the two together? So that has been my thought all this while.
Very, very good, good point. If you go through Robert Lupton's book on toxic charity, and Colbert and Fickert do the same thing on When Helping Hurts, both of those will talk about emergency aid. Okay, when there's crisis or people in crisis, we need to meet immediate needs. That could be disaster, crises, situation. People are on the street, and of course, we can sit here right now looking at our computers and talk about these things in theory, abstractly. When you're on the street, it makes it a lot more difficult. I worked in gospel rescue missions for several years, and that kind of became, this is a common issue that we are always wrestling with. Okay. We need to help people immediately. When a woman and her child are on the street, we would try to get them into some kind of housing immediately. No questions asked. We didn't say, well, let's see if we can figure out if you need an asset-based approach or an aid-based. Now, of course, those are just irrelevant at that moment, right? We need to get that woman and her child off the street and into a safe place. So that's the emergency aid that's needed. The more long-term strategy, though, is then we needed to figure out, okay, what can we do to help this woman begin to change her life? And then we had classes. We would hook up, another woman who would become the mentor to that woman, and that became, a part of that approach. So yeah, there's this contrast between emergency aid, and then there's the more long-term asset-based approach. So you're right, Tammy. I think we need to learn how to, incorporate both of those strategies, depending on what's happening at any moment in time. In our context of research, we have to determine, okay, what can we do in the term of research that's going to help us address this issue even more effectively. In Arissa's case, we're talking about Rwanda. Okay, we've
change that only these other people coming in from the outside could make those changes.
One idea that I had now, but before I move there, where are you, Melissa? That we can hear the birds. I'm sorry about that, but this place looks amazing. I'm sorry. Anyways, but how about to mention the process from the aid emergency time to the ABC. We are facing that with a family in this land, that they had an emergency, but they want to keep being attended. When it stops, when it's time to check the asset, how is this process? I'm struggling a lot with them to move on. And how this process goes, how can we explain them, how can we establish that? How are the steps? Maybe it's an idea.
Okay, I'd like to make some observations in terms of what has just been shared. I think what I'm hearing you say is that you are viewing the research that you are going to do or that you're proposing to do, you're expecting it to bring change to people's mindsets. I think I'm hearing that over and over again in the discussions, etc. And so I want to say that the purpose of the research is not, and I know this is going to be very disappointing, to bring change to people's mindset. The purpose of the research is for you to understand that mindset that you think needs to be changed, because you are not going to be able to bring change until you understand that mindset and you read it rightly. And in different ways, I've made that comment to different ones of you. Now, here's a situation. And we talked about assumptions. We always start our research with assumptions. That's important. In a good piece of research, you state your assumptions up front. However, you have to be careful that you do not design your research to give you the answer that you think should be there. And that is why you have to go to the research with an open mind to let the results speak for themselves. Because it may be, and that this may surprise you, it may be for those of you who are looking at asset and aid-based development, it may be that these people who seem to be locked into aid-based help understand that it is not the best approach. So then you have to ask the question, why is it, though that they understand it is not the best approach, they are locked into it? Now, the other thing that concerns me that I hear that you seem to be saying is that it is the recipients of the aid-based assistance who are responsible for the continuation of that approach. I want to suggest to you that no, it is bigger than that.
I totally agree.
I
totally agree with you on that.
If I could finish, there is unfortunately among the helping community, there is sometimes, whether accidentally or intentionally, when we want to perpetuate what we are doing because it gives us satisfaction. And so we either consciously or unconsciously do not facilitate and help the recipients of our aid to become empowered and to develop. So we have to be careful not to blame the victims, but to understand there are multiple issues. It's a complex issue. When you look at the issue of poverty and how you alleviate it and how you help people, it's a complex issue when you look at women in leadership and what it is that helps women to come forward and to demonstrate their leadership ability. It's never just an issue that it's the women who are lacking. It's bigger than that. And I just want you to bear that in mind as you go forth in your various studies.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Henry. I totally agree with you. I don't think it is the victims who are responsible. I think there are several external factors that have created that mindset.
And this is Bill. Sorry, my internet dropped out a little bit ago. The student I was working with this last year in Jamaica, Tisha, again, that was one of the issues that she did research. She was understanding the mindset of people in churches who were, working in their aid programs, and she was working with something called Nazarene Compassionate Ministries. And so as she understood the mindset she discovered was very, very limited. When she would ask churches and people, what are you doing to help people improve their lives? They would be some of the common, well, we've put together a soup kitchen, we made a food pantry. She just got some of the same same kinds of answers from most of the people because they had not learned how to think outside of a particular set of parameters. So I think as we've just talked about then, those who are given the aid are just as much responsible for creating the mindset as those that are receiving the aid. And so we can't just start with those who are receiving the aid. We need to probably start educating people that are giving the aid in more creative ways to enter into people's lives. The other question I guess I want to throw in here, well, two questions, statements. One is, okay, we're looking at a situation, changing people's perceptions. Okay, Melissa has talked about that with the women. Arissa has talked about that with aid-based versus asset-based. We're changing perceptions. And we know that, well, let me ask a question first. When we talk about AI, for example, appreciative inquiry, one of the principles of appreciative inquiry, and maybe you can comment on this, Dr. Henry, because I'm wrestling with this a little bit. One of the principles of an appreciative inquiry approach, there's the 4 or 5D cycle, define, go through the various Ds of an appreciative inquiry approach. But one of the principles is to learn to ask questions in such a way that it helps people think about possibilities as opposed to just the negative. So in that sense, I'm thinking, is that a preconceived approach to questions from an appreciative inquiry that would not necessarily be appropriate for a pure research approach? I'm wrestling with that just right now as we think of an appreciative approach to asking questions. There is somewhat of a sense of trying to influence a person for the positive. Now, is that justified if we're using an appreciative inquiry approach? I don't know. I'll ask you directly, Dr. Henry. What do you think about that?
I think that the appreciative inquiry has its place in research. It has demonstrated that over and over by the kinds of research that have been done. But every, whatever approach we take to research, one of the things we end up recognizing is our own limitedness or limited understanding of the issues that we want to understand. And the issue is always more complex than we think. However, what research does is to help us to unlock and to understand certain aspects so that we could have an open-minded approach to whatever the challenges is that is before us. And I want to believe that the process of doing research, especially when you do your interviews, your focus group, etc., what you're doing is getting people to think about issues that they probably have not thought about before, or they have thought about those issues and they've and maybe have dismissed them, and then because you were doing the research and they've been involved in your process, they become aware again and they want to grapple that. That is a sideline to what happens in the process. But we always have to come to the research process with what I call a healthy sense of skepticism, in the sense that we want to be careful that we're not assuming that our research will answer all the questions or bring solutions. We mentioned earlier the issue of perceptions. How do we change people's perceptions? Well, there's a lot of research in the field of psychology and sociology that addresses the issue of perception. And it is not easy to change people's perception. It takes time to change perceptions. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to change perceptions, but in the process of doing so, we have to be aware that changing perceptions is quite a task.
Yeah, that's good. And I'm thinking specifically appreciative inquiry. Like I said, one of the principles of appreciative inquiry is to focus on the positive, not the negative. That can get us into trouble, though, if we, by doing that, we go into a situation and we're asking questions that are not even allowing a person to talk about the negative, right? And the negative is something we need to know about people's, let's say, negative perceptions that tend to be detrimental to their own life or situation. So before we start trying to even use our questions to try to change people's thinking, I agree with what Dr. Henry has said. We need to go in with trying to get rid of what we think is best, even what we think are the right questions that will help change a person's mindset. That very approach defeat our ability to actually truly understand what someone is thinking, because we're going in with the mindset that I'm going to use my question to try to change their thinking. That may not be the time to be trying to change a person's thinking. We are at that point, we are simply trying to understand try to get into another person's world to begin to understand that. When we talk about, and we'll talk about qualitative, quantitative approaches more, I guess, starting even next week. But when we talk about qualitative research, say a qualitative interview, we traditionally say that in a qualitative approach, I'm not trying to test a particular hypothesis. I'm simply going into a situation. I will possibly guide an interview with some questions, but I'm looking for themes, we call it, to come forth from the interview. One of the approaches is called grounded theory, and that simply just means that out of the ground of, say, an interview, out of that environment will emerge themes that will then help you come to a conclusion or a principle or a hypothesis about why people think in such a way or why something happens in a certain way. A qualitative approach is seeking to go in with the least amount of preconceived ideas as possible and allowing the ideas, the principles, the themes to emerge out of our discussions, say, with people in an interview. I guess the other question I wanted to ask, and I've been thinking about that, okay, we're dealing with the issue of like changing people's perceptions, okay? We understand, and we've just said that's probably the most difficult thing to do. But as we think about research, as you're thinking, you think about your research questions, as you're thinking about changing perceptions, what is it do you need to know about the people that you're going to be interacting with? What is it you need to know about them to even help you begin to change perceptions? What do you need to know about the people that are, say, receiving aid resources, and what do you need to know about the people that are giving aid? You need to understand those mindsets before you can even begin to develop processes to begin to change possibly some detrimental kinds of thinking. But to start, what do you need to know about those people? And that's where you start designing your questions, your research approach to help you best get at that knowledge that will actually help you begin a process of change. Okay, other thoughts, comments? I'm going to spend a few minutes at the end of the section here just to talk about some of the theological sections of the literature review, but I just want to, I think this has been a good discussion as we're kind of thinking what we're trying to do with research. And in this case, we're talking about, changing people's perceptions, which is a common issue that we're often dealing with in transformation. It's changing how people see a situation or see their lives or see their, their conditions.
This is Jeremy.
Hey, Jeremy.
Hey, sorry, I go in and out with my video because my bandwidth is low sometimes. On the appreciative inquiry side, I just wanted to add a couple of thoughts on that in terms of methodology. I do think it's important to think about appreciative inquiry as a data collection research method as compared to a change process. So if you're, because it as a model, it can be used both ways. And it rightly is seeking a sense of collective census building based on a shared history and a sense of a shared future and how to live that out. And for some people, that process itself is actually transformative when you look at Mesereau's work on the learning process, when you look at self-authorship and meaning-making and kind of education literature, it gets at that. And so I do think that distinction is important. One of the kind of two premises of appreciative inquiry, though, Dr. Payne, that I think as I'm sorting through it as a research method are data collection versus a change process. One is that first D is defining the issue and collectively defining the issue. And a lot of times some of the what is the need, what's wrong, what's not quite working, that kind of stuff actually comes in the defining the issue. What is it we are trying to respond to as a group? And so even though the data collection process from that point is asking more appreciative asset-based questions, it's sometimes in response to a sense of lack or angst or something. So I wonder if there's a little space there even to kind of give permission. In Hammond's book, that thin book on appreciative inquiry, she argues that you can't start with a needs-based process and then successfully do appreciative inquiry out of it. And I'm actually not quite sure about that. Because that seems a little hopeless to ever kind of turn a ship. I think that process can probably start anywhere. But the other thing about appreciative inquiry and thinking about how it frames questions, a premise of appreciative inquiry is that all questions actually limit and shape an interaction. So think about a survey. The presence or absence of a question, no matter how open or closed it is, if you give me 20 questions on a survey and I'm looking to respond to all 20, I'm potentially thinking of 5 questions that I never would have thought of if you just had said, hey, tell me about this situation generally. Same thing with appreciative inquiry. It's pressing specifically toward where do you see the positive, where do you see the possibilities, where do you see the assets, where do you see the gifts? And yes, it's asking for a specific kind of data, but if that's connected to your goal, if that's the kind of data you need, it's a really good research method. So you have to match it as a research method to the goals of your project. If there's a big gap on needing to define an issue and it doesn't clearly fit there, then you have to be able to incorporate that too. So I don't know, I think I've just found handling it as a change process versus handling it as a research method, often a data collection method. There are some other things that make a little more sense, and the question asking can be compared to, what you include or don't include on a survey, because ultimately it's the kind of data that you're trying to get for the purposes of the project you're after. But it's got to be driven by that problem and purpose, not just data for the sake of data. So that's how I've been thinking about it. I don't know if that's helpful for anybody.
Yeah. That is helpful, Jeremy. Thanks. Yeah, and I think that's a good observation that appreciative inquiry, and I just wrote these down just for my own thinking again. Is a process. There is a change. There is the change component, but the first part, define, discover. That really is, that's the research part that we're talking about of trying to understand what the situation is. Without my preconceived ideas, okay? So in that sense, the AI approach starts with trying to accurately understand a situation. So in this case, say perceptions of people. We're trying to understand the perceptions of people, possibly how they came to those perceptions. How did they go through life and come to those perceptions? How are those perceptions affecting the way they live their life now? See, that's all part of the define discover phase. As we move to the dream and design, dream, of course, as we've got our research, as we've gotten some understanding of the situation, then we start trying to dream. We start trying to think, okay, what could be? What are some of the, what could this situation look like if everything was functioning, let's say the way God would want it to function? We talk about the term shalom, shalom leadership. Shalom means that sense of well-being, of needs being met, of people exercising their gifts, their resources in a way that is productive. All that is part of when we at BGU talk about shalom. Okay, and a shalom leadership is trying to work in situations to bring about that kind of empowerment, that kind of efficient use of resources, all that goes into the shalom. So, as we dream, we try to help. If we're trying to facilitate a situation, we may be helping people to dream. And then it's, based on what we've done in our empirical research, what we've heard in terms of what people are thinking about solutions, what might help, then we start to design, in our case, say a transformational strategy. And we've tried to emphasize in this course, we know that we're not going to just make huge, amazing transformations just through this one dissertation process. But we can begin a process. We can become catalysts, so to speak, in our situations to begin the process of change. And so we start designing an approach. And then, as we've designed that, then we try to deliver that approach. We try it out, we test it. Okay, and so that's how I kind of see the appreciative inquiry model being applied to say what we're trying to do in a dissertation process, going from the discovering, defining what actually the situation is, to finally delivering some kind of a transformational strategy that begins to address the issue. Okay. I was kind of thinking about, what we're doing in our literature review chapter. And remember, in our literature review chapter, we are working at we call it the theoretical framework. Sometimes that word theory, I've already said, sometimes that trips me up, because when I think of the word theory, I think of models that have not yet been proven. And I actually had to go look up in the dictionary to see that there are two, and I've said this before, there's actually two almost opposite definitions of the word theory. One is a set of principles, concepts, constructs that have been analyzed, tested, and proven in some sense. I never have thought about the word theory in that sense. I've always thought of the word theory like, Einstein's theory of relativity. It's a theory. It's not necessarily been proven, but there are a lot of good indicators that this theory may possibly be true, but it's still a theory. But so sometimes I've had trouble with the term theoretical framework just because of my perception, my background. I have to get to use the idea that that's a theoretical framework. We're using it in the sense that it's a set of concepts. I seem to be struggling with my internet today. But I was trying to make the point that, in the literature review, we are dealing with, we're going to use the word theories in the sense that they are models, constructs, concepts, principles that we are trying to apply to a particular problem. that we've defined in our in our problem statement. So we've been talking about asset-based community development. That's a model of community development that is a worthwhile model that can be discussed in a literature review, and bringing some of the relevant literature that gives the reader some understanding of what asset-based community development means. Okay, we do the same thing. And let me share my screen again. Since my internet went down, I lost my sharing. Let me bring this back on the screen. If we're thinking about theological concepts, I'm not sure if my internet is going to allow me to get through this session, but we'll try again. Wait a minute. Okay, we're going to share. All right. In years past, the biblical theology reflections has been a separate chapter. What we've done over the last year, and several schools have been doing this, that with theological schools, we've taken the theology sections and we've integrated them into the literature review, because the rationale for that being that the theological constructs, principles, concepts, whatever word you want to use, are an integral part of your whole theoretical framework. And since the literature review is the place that you are dealing with the theoretical framework, the conceptual framework for your dissertation, we as faculty felt that it was appropriate to include the theological section or sections within the literature review, because it's a part of your whole theoretical framework. So, like I was saying, we have various concepts that we talk about in theology that have, at BGU, we talk about, say, theology of work. That's a concept that you can look up that word. You can go to Google Scholar and you can put in the word theology of work, and you're going to come up with a lot of literature that has been written in the last few years on the concept, the biblical concept of theology of work. You're not going to find that term in the Bible, but you are going to find a lot of biblical texts, descriptions of people functioning within biblical days that seem to demonstrate a theology of work. Okay, going back to Genesis, where God seems to bless work and is the one who put Adam in the garden to do work, and the work is to be productive. God talks about filling the earth, multiplying and filling the earth, and taking care of the earth. All of that is part of the theology of work. So that is a model of thinking that is biblically based, that we can take and apply, say, to a particular problem. And so you can find all these different theological concepts, constructs, servant leadership, incarnational leadership, contextual leadership, all of our transformational leadership perspectives are pieces of a possible theoretical framework. We could even, parent-child relationships, marriage relationships, business, reconciliation, justice, social responsibility. Again, those are all concepts that we can talk about from a biblical perspective that we can then apply to our projects. All right. So when we're talking about, the theology, the theological components of a theoretical framework, this is the kind of topics that we're talking about. and this is just, you know, a limited list. Just trying to give an example, though, of the kinds of topics that would be appropriate to include in the literature review that are defining some theological principles that are part of your framework. And for a BGU dissertation, you are required to include some components from a theological perspective that are applicable to your particular topic. I'll stop there, and we can have questions. If you do have questions, if you don't, that's fine too. I mean, this week, I think in the discussion, you're trying to talk about specifically theological themes that seem to have some relevance for your particular topic, and that those, you know, those theological themes will become subheadings within your literature review. Okay, and then you would, for the literature review, you're discussing that particular theme, topic, based on what you are reading from other authors, and then you interact with those authors, summarizing their conclusions, analyzing what they're saying. You may indicate places whether you agree, disagree, where you may want to say in your project you're going to try to expand that thinking a little bit because as it applies to an XYZ, right? So any thoughts, questions on the theological sections? Again, it's just, again, another part of the theoretical framework from using theological language to apply to your topic.
I'm struggling to find other sources, other peer-reviewed sources that on the theology of, and I did go into Google Scholar and search for the integration of theology with leadership empowerment and some of these other terms, key terms that I am trying to define. And I'm just nothing. I don't know. I'm just struggling with finding other articles to source.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anyone can give help on that issue? Because the key is always to know how to enter the search terms. Okay. You use the terms integrating what theology and leadership and empowerment. There might be some other terms.
Okay. I would like to just address that. That is just one search term that you could use. And I did it with a few of your work. I'm not sure if I did it with Melissa, but especially I started out looking at it in terms of poverty alleviation, and there's so much there. No, it's not just integration of theology. That's one term you could use. What about the Bible and women in leadership? Well, if you put that in, you're going to see a lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. The Bible and leadership efficacy. So you could use the Bible as another search term. You could use Christian or Christianity as another search term. You could use religion because religion includes Christianity. That could be another. So you could say religion and asset-based community development. And I thank Jeremy for reminding us again that the ABCD approach is not so much a concept as a method that you may use in your research. Okay, so those are some terms. The Bible, religion, Christianity are some terms you may put in with your specific interest area. And I'm sure you're going to pull up peer-reviewed literature to help you as you continue in your reading. And I just want to make another comment with respect to the review of the literature that you're going into now. As I was reflecting on it, and I haven't discussed it with Dr. Payne yet, but I thought to myself, ideally for me, that's where we should start in the research process, with reading the literature. I'm saying that because as you start going into the literature, you may find that you want to revise some of what you have in chapter 1. That is normal. If that happens, please don't feel frustrated, because the literature will open up a realm of learning and knowledge that you do not yet have as you go into the research process. So bear that in mind, that you have to go to the literature with an open mind. And what you want to avoid, and I want to make that clear, is not just to focus on literature which you feel support your position. That's not good research. You have to go to the literature with an open mind and allow the literature to help you to understand and formulate your research. So I say that to say, when you start to read the literature, don't be frustrated if you feel like, oh, maybe I need to revise my question, or maybe I need to revise this approach. It may be most of you are indicating that you are going to use appreciative inquiry as the method to do your study, but you may find that as you read the research literature, that perhaps there are other approaches that you may take. Be open to that.
Okay, yeah, that's good.
Dr. Payne, I have a question about the theological themes that you were describing and how we need to incorporate them into our study. My question is, if I already, like my study already has a theological theme in it, you know, biblical principles on, you know, asset-based, so to speak. So they're already a theological concept or theological framework in the study. So now, is that sufficient, or do I have to bring in additional theological themes into the discussion?
Well, I think, like in your case, the secular term asset-based community development, you know, that's the secular. And I don't like the word secular sacred, but just for the sake of discussion, we'll use the term secular. That's a model, asset-based community development. You are basically describing that model with your phrase, what's in your hand, right? And you will, you know, in that context, you're talking about, you know, what has God given me? Am I being a good steward of what God, you know, stewardship? We can find some biblical concepts of that. God's provision, all those biblical concepts can be related to asset-based community development. So in a sense, you are looking at asset-based community development from a theological perspective and defining that secular term from a biblical perspective. So in your case, yeah, you're already including the theological discussion as you're talking about asset-based community development. You could have a section on asset-based community development and talk about that just in terms of some of the regular secular authors. You could then possibly have a second section that talks about theological components of asset-based community development. And then you could talk about it from a theological perspective. That would be one approach if you just wanted to organize it that way in your literature review.
I would also like to add that when you look at the theological approach, it will be helpful for you to access to see if people have done your research within the context of the church/religious organizations, because that will give you some insight as to the breadth of the issue that you want to look at. You will always want to see, has somebody studied this in the context of a faith-based organization, a church setting, because that will enrich the work that you are seeking to do because of the context in which we are working.
Thanks.
Also, getting back, and then we do need to close down the session, but I think you know, as Melissa asked the question, you know, in terms of when you're doing database searches, you really do have to try to think creatively about all the possible ways to enter the search terms. Like I say, if you enter, you know, say theological integration with a particular topic, yeah, that may or may not bring up some topics. So then, you know, as Dr. Henry said, you might use other words: religion, Bible, Christian, then combining, you know, some of those generic words that get us into the religious, biblical, theological areas, and then plug in a topic. You know, women in leadership, poverty alleviation, stewardship of resources. You know, whatever you're dealing with, tie it to one of those terms: religion, Bible, theology, and see what you come up with. I gave you that one little site from Wikipedia just to give some of you who may not realize just how many theological journals are out there. I think that particular list had 4,000 listed. I was mainly giving you that idea. And the term peer-reviewed, let me just talk about it one more moment. If an article is in a journal, a respected journal, we would consider that peer-reviewed because there is an editorial staff of experts that are on the review board for that journal that are reviewing articles that then make it into a particular journal. If you're finding articles in typical respected journals, okay, those, from my perspective, are peer-reviewed. Okay, would that be your understanding, Dr. Henry, also?
Yes, agreed. Yes.
Because I know that term continually is confusing people. What is a peer-reviewed article? And I think we're just trying to distinguish that from, I can go on the internet and I can just come up with I can get thousands of opinion piece articles to support any particular statement that I would like to make. But peer-reviewed, there has been generally a group, and I'm going to call it an editorial board often for a journal that is reviewing those articles, that even allows those articles to become published within those journals. So when you're finding articles within journals, respected academic, theological, whatever the discipline happens to be, psychological, sociological, community development, journals that relate to these various topics, I would say those are generally going to be peer-reviewed articles because they've been qualified to be published within those particular journals. I hope that helps.
Dr. Payne, real quick before you go,
Mm-hmm.
I just have a burning question
Mm-hmm.
regarding the themes. So in this little subtopics, I'm understanding, you know, we have our 3 major subtopics in our literature review area, and then we have our theology of whatever as one of those subtopics.
Mm-hmm.
But then here we're referring to various themes. How many themes then do we need to have under that subtopic?
You know, I'm going to say, I'm just throwing out a number, 3 to 5, okay? You don't want to make it so complex that, you know, you've kind of taken the reader into a very complex and you can, like I say, you can organize your literature review in a couple of different ways. You could have, like I just said for Arissa, he could have a theme, a subheading that says asset-based community development. He could talk about that from just a general secular point of view. He could then have a second theme that says asset-based ABCD in relationship to biblical understandings or something. He could have a second that, or he could do both of those in the same subheading if he wanted to. That would be one approach. So another approach. Go ahead.
The overall themes for the literature review chapter. I'm talking about themes that we're referring to just under the theological section.
Okay, that's what I say. You could organize the literature review. You could have two main parts. You could have the non-theological section, and you could list some themes, and then you could have a theological section. Dallas Theological Seminary, that's how they do it. They have you divide the literature review into actually two main parts, and they put all the theology under one part, they put all the others under another part. That's one way you could do it, but you don't have to do that. You could just have, 3 to 5 themes throughout the whole literature review. Some of those themes are specifically theologically related. Some of those themes are not necessarily theologically related. So you could organize it in either one of those ways. You could two big parts, theological, non-theological, or just having themes, some themes that are theological, some that are not so theological. That makes sense?
Well, I'm not going to have non-theological themes under my theological section. What I'm asking for this week's assignment, because I've already got my 3 other key themes that I've done the literature review for, and now this week I'm just working on this one little sub area that's the theological leadership empowerment. So now I'm wondering, what are the expectations in terms of how many themes I need to have under there, how long does this section need to be, how many paragraphs? I know I need to put sources.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, in your case, you are organizing a separate integrated theme called theological perspective, whatever you're going to call that, and then you're going to have some subtopics underneath that heading, right? Okay, and so that's one way to do it, and that's fine. So under that theological perspectives, or whatever you're going to call that main subheading, you may have 2, 3. If it's a heading called theological perspectives, I probably wouldn't have more than 3 to 5 themes underneath that. Okay, you may only have 2 themes. That's fine, because the theological perspective is one of your main subheadings for the whole chapter, and then underneath that subheading, you've got some sub themes. So you could have anywhere from 2 to 5. I'm just going to say in terms of theological themes that fit into that major subheading of your literature review chapter. That'd be my perspective right now. But again, I do want to make it clear that you could organize your chapter in different ways. You could have one theme like Melissa just mentioned that's called theological perspectives with some theological perspectives, or each of your themes may have some theological underpinnings that you aren't necessarily going to just separate one section that you're calling the theological section. You may choose to just integrate the theology into each one of your subsections in the chapter, and that's fine. Then you don't need to have a separate section that you're calling the theological section. Okay, I'm just saying that there are options in the way you creatively organize your literature review chapter. There's a question from Tammy. Dr. Claire, I have a question for you. You said you should add culture and context as it relates to the practices of transformational servant leadership. I need some explanation. You should add culture and context as it relates to the practice of transformational servant leadership. Okay, well, yeah, Dr. Henry could say a few words about that.
Okay, that response could be for each person in terms of the specific study that you're doing. I made that comment to Tammy specifically because of what he shared in in terms of the focus of his own study, but the concepts of culture and context is relevant to each of your study. And basically what you are doing for the reader, and in our opening discussion with Erissa, that is where we were taking Erissa, is being able to identify the context in which you're doing your study and to state how that context may impact your study. I hope I made sense there.
Let me make one comment that this just struck me, and I don't know if it's helpful. The term servant leadership could mean different things in different contexts, cultures. This is an extreme. In biblical days, it was a polite, customary custom to wash somebody's feet if they came into your house. Okay, that would be a servant leadership. Here in my place in Idaho, the United States, if somebody came into my house and I removed their shoes and began to wash their feet, they probably wouldn't interpret that as servant leadership, right? That doesn't fit my culture. So you need to define, in your case, you're trying to determine, say in your situation, Tammy, how will teaching concepts of servant leadership in your discipleship programs, will that actually have any effect on the spiritual growth of the people in your particular church? But in your context, people would need to even help you understand, what does servant leadership even look like in our particular culture? What would it mean for someone to serve someone in your culture? It may mean something different in my culture. So I think that's kind of in terms of how you contextualize a concept into your particular culture.
Okay, I will try. I will make attempts.
Yeah, I mean, we really have to, and we really are. We emphasize a lot at BGU understanding the culture in which we're functioning. And we've pretty much ran out of time, but we could go into just a lot of different issues. There's a whole website. It's called Hofstede Dimensions of Cultural. I forget the whole thing, but Hofstede did a whole study of various characteristics of various cultures that are very different. So when I, as say a business leader, go into a particular culture, I need to be aware of the characteristics of that culture so that I am not offending people, causing problems very unintentional. So being aware of the culture in which we're working is very important. When we have the section worldview in the chapter 1, some of that gets at that. Worldview will even affect how we exercise ministry or business in a particular culture, because we have to contextualize it to the norms, the values, the belief system of that particular culture. All right. We've gone over our time.
Under where can that come in? Is it under the literature review or back to chapter 1?
Well, it really depends. You could make, if the culture issue was really important, you may want to include a whole section in your literature review on cultural norms within your particular setting. I think in your case, if you're going to talk about servant leadership, it seems to me servant leadership would be, I think I mentioned this when I responded to your written work, you had a general section called transformational leadership. I said, I thought since you're dealing specifically with servant leadership, that should be the title of one of the subsections for your literature review.
Yeah.
You could, in that section, talk about servant leadership from various authors, but I would imagine it would also be appropriate to talk about what servant leadership means within your particular culture. what is
Okay.
meaningful? And somebody, I'm trying to see who is. Let me see where the noise is coming from. Okay, looks like everybody's now muted. Anyway, yeah, becoming aware of what's going on in your particular culture is also important. And you could deal with that if you so chose under a theme of servant leadership, talk about various authors. And if you even found somebody who talked about what it meant to serve, say, within your particular culture, that would be helpful for a reader to know that's how servant leadership might be demonstrated in your particular culture. You know, when I used to do counseling in marriage, I would talk about, you know, each different people have different love languages, and we have to learn the love language of our spouse in order to demonstrate love that will be meaningful. Likewise, say in the term of servant leadership, I would need to know what actually would be communicated as serving someone in my culture before I could actually exercise servant leadership. I could know servant leadership in an abstract manner, but there may be some specific ways in your culture servant leadership would be exercised that would actually demonstrate love and care to a person. All right, enough said. We could kind of keep going on. There's so many things to be said, but let's keep working at some of these issues. You're working on, keep working on your literature review chapter this week. If again, either do like Melissa has indicated, have a section that's going to be called Theological Perspectives and list a few themes underneath there, or some of the general themes within your chapter already are going to be dealt with from a theological perspective, and that's fine. Then just keep working at that this week. Do tell me though, and I think you're doing it in your discussions, in your mind, what are some of the theologically related themes, either that you're dealing with in one section or that are kind of integrated within a few different sections in your literature review. All right, with that, I am going to have to close the session because our Zoom time will run out. But I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you sticking with us to get through some of these thoughts. Next week, we are going to, next week we're into week 8. Just amazing. But we are going to talk a little bit about, for the next 2 weeks, and you can keep bringing up issues about literature review, that's fine. But we'll start to deal specifically with the research methodology and, what are the different kinds of research methodologies and what kinds of issues should you be aware of as you're trying to design a research methodology that will help you address the problem, help you get at the kind of information that you need to understand in terms of people, perceptions, social infrastructures, organizations, whatever it is that you're doing. A methodology, a research methodology is going to help you understand that situation a little more fully, okay? Okay, with that, I'm going to end the meeting and keep working at the discussions this week and turn in your papers, and I'll keep interacting with you in that mode.